There was a lovely young widow named Judith, or Judy. And if your name is Judy, this is where your name comes from. There is another Judith in the Bible. Does anybody know who she is? I know you don't, but, it's just... In fact, I've got to make sure that I can tell you the right references here. Esau's first wife was named Judith. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite. He was a guy who ran a pub and made beer. Beeri the Hittite. Actually, the word beer means well. Wells in the ancient world had beer instead of water in them. Judith was his daughter. What does Judah mean? Judah is the masculine form and Judith is the feminine form. What does Judah or Judith mean? Praise. Okay. So, Judy. She is a young widow, but she's still very beautiful to look at. And that's important for this story. Well, this story takes place, according to the opening statement of the narrative, in the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh. And it continues on in what is marked as the 4th chapter of it. It says that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Assyrians, had been attacking the nations, and the people of Israel were terrified because they had only recently returned from the captivity. So this is after the return from Babylonian captivity that Nebuchadnezzar is ruling over the Assyrians and over all these places. Now, what does that tell you when you start to read the story and it says that? What's wrong with that? Somebody. Anybody. What's wrong with that? Was Nebuchadnezzar the king of the Assyrians? No. Did he rule in Nineveh? No. Was he king after the exile? No. No. Whoever wrote this is either really stupid, which is not the case, or is deliberately letting us know that this is a work of fiction. It takes place in a parallel universe. Okay. It's not supposed to be taken as fiction. It's an allegorical story. Well, what is the story? Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, made war on Arphaxad, the name of the first person born after the flood, who was ruling over the Medes in Ecbatana. Okay, and when Nebuchadnezzar made war on Arphaxad of Ecbatana, he summoned all the nations in his empire to come and join forces with him. But all the people in Israel and Egypt, those parts of his empire, they said, nah, we're not going to bother to come. And so, after Nebuchadnezzar had defeated his Median enemies in Ecbatana, King Arphaxad, he sent his general Holofernes to punish all the nations that didn't obey him and come to fight with him in his war. So Holofernes begins a march out of Nineveh, and he comes into Syria and all these places, and he's punishing all these people. And not only that, but he is imposing a new religion. He's destroying all the old gods and putting up temples to Nebuchadnezzar so that the people will worship Nebuchadnezzar and him alone as the only God. So now he's come to the land of Israel, and he is laying siege to the town of Bethulia. Now this is a symbolic name. Does anybody have any guess as to what the word Bethulia means? What do you think it might mean?
Son of something?
House of something, son of that. You would think that. It means virgin. Okay. It means virgin. Behold, a virgin shall conceive. A young woman, a virgin of marriageable age. In other words, not 7 years old. A young woman eligible for marriage. He's laying siege to that. So it's symbolically and allegorically the virgin daughter of Israel that's under attack. And as he lays siege, one of his officers in his army named Arioch, who was from the Ammonites, says, you know what? You're not going to be able to conquer these Israelites because their God is more powerful than anybody else. Now, if they sin, their God will turn against them and you'll defeat them. But if they don't sin, you might as well just pass these people by because you won't be able to defeat them. Well, Holofernes, he doesn't buy that. And so he kicks Arioch out and sends him over to Bethulia and says, you'll die when all these Israelites die after I conquer the city. Well, there isn't much food and water left in the city, and the city is about ready to surrender when Judith calls the elders together. She lives there. She's a wealthy widow. Her husband has left her with lots of money, and she says, no, I'll take care of this. You just trust the Lord. So Judith puts on all of her beautiful clothes that she used to wear before she was a widow. She puts on her bracelets and anklets and earrings and nose rings and everything else and makes herself smell good with oils. And she goes out to the camp of Holofernes. Well, she's so beautiful that they don't do anything to her. They bring her right before General Holofernes, and he thinks she's real cute too. And she says, look, you're never going to be able to defeat this city, but I'll tell you what's going to happen, my lord. Those people are going to get so hungry, they're already talking about eating the sacrificial animals. And they're going to eat the first fruits that have been set aside for the Lord, and they're probably going to eat some dogs and cats. They're going to violate the laws of God, and as soon as they do that, they're finished. God will give them over into your hands. Now, I've got spies in the city, and I'm going to stay out here, and I'm going to let you know when they start committing this sin, because when they do, they'll be demoralized, and God will be against them, and you'll be able to conquer them. So Holofernes thinks that's just fine. That'll make it easy. All he has to do is keep the siege up. So she stays there for a couple of days, and then Holofernes says to himself, you know, I simply must commit adultery with this woman. She is too beautiful. All my men will make fun of me if I don't. So he sets up a banquet just for the two of them. She's been counting on this. And he invites her to come to this banquet, and she says, sure. And he says, I've got all this neat food. And she says, well, I can't eat your food. I have to eat the Jewish food, but I'll eat my food and you eat your food. So they have this banquet together, and he's got his plans and she has her plans. And she keeps plying him with wine, you know. Some more wine, my lord? So after a while, he's just lying there drunk. And as she lies there drunk, she takes a sword and chops his head off, puts it in the bag, sneaks out the back of the tent. Of course, everybody figures this is going to take all night long, so none of the soldiers are going to come looking for him and disturbing him in the morning because he's with Judith, but except he's not. And she takes this bag with his head in it back to the town of Virgin, and they stick it up on the wall, and Nebuchadnezzar's army is so demoralized that it's easily defeated by the armies of the Israelites, and then they sing a song of praise. Well, this is a very famous story. You go to an art museum, you're going to see pictures of Judith and the head of Holofernes. Where does this story come from? What stories does this remind you of? This is a composite of a whole bunch of things in the Bible. Tell me some Bible stories that you heard told again in this one.
Story in Judges, the woman,
Deborah
not
and Jael. Okay, Jael crushing the head of Sisera. Two original warrior babes, and now we have the third warrior babe, Judy. And what else? What other story in Judges is alluded to here? Who killed somebody and managed to get away while nobody thought to look for the guy he just killed? Okay, Ehud killed Eglon, booked it back, organized the army, and was able to defeat them. And the most famous story that's alluded to here, who's the Lion of Zion? Who's the Lion of Judah? What'd he do? Whose head he cut off? Goliath's head, see? So now we got the Lioness of Zion here. Judith, the Lioness of Judah, and she cuts off a head. Now, when was this story written? It was written probably about 150 BC or later, because it refers to the Sanhedrin and other things that did not exist before that time. What's it about? Is this subversive literature? Is this encouraging, if you don't like what the Gentiles are doing as they rule over you, then just rise up against them? Or is it just a fun story? Hard to know. But allegorically, it is that the inviolable daughter of the Lord, the virgin daughter of Judah, is going to be protected by God, and God will raise up those to protect. So now you know who Judith was and what that story's about. That takes care of the Apocrypha and everything that was going to be said about it. And I talked briefly last week about the pseudepigraphical writings, Maybe talk a little bit more about that, and then we can stop for a second and see if there's any attenuated questions that have lingered from the last couple of weeks. If you look on your first block of notes, what you have from last time, on page 5, there they are listed, okay? The ones that are important that you'll see references to are up at the top under Apocalyptic, the first one, the book of Enoch. That's important because if you were to look at the book of Jude, which I will do for you, Jude tells us about Enoch. This is the Enoch who lived before the flood. And he says in Jude verse 14, about these apostates, he's talking about the apostates in the church. And Enoch is talking about the apostates of his day, the sons of God who have started to intermarry with the daughters of men. Okay, so about these apostates, also Enoch in the 7th generation from Adam prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord came with many myriads of his holy ones, to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds, which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Now, that seems fine. Somehow or other, Jude knew something that Enoch had said 3,000 years earlier. Maybe it was preserved in some writing we don't have. This statement is also found in the book of Enoch, which is possibly written 100 BC, maybe later than that. And so you'll have scholars say, well, Jude picks this up from the book of Enoch. And then you have fruitcakes in Christian circles who say, well, that means the book of Enoch is inspired. We need to take it very seriously. Well, it doesn't mean any of those things. We don't know if Jude got it from Enoch or if later editions of Enoch took it out from Jude. We don't know, okay, because there is more than one version of the book of Enoch. Moreover, we don't know if both of them got it from a common source, which is the most likely thing, that there were records that are now gone. God hasn't seen fit to preserve them, that kept some of these sayings from people before the flood and other times, and the book of Enoch pulled that one up, and so did Jude. But you'll see that, and that's why the book of Enoch, you'll hear it referred to, you'll hear people say as if they just know for a fact that the book of Jude is quoting the book of Enoch, and there's no reason on earth to take that seriously. The other one we discussed last week is the assumption of Moses here. That's the 5th one listed, which says that Satan fought over Moses' body, or Moses was taken up into heaven after he died. And then supposedly that's also in Jude, and I pointed out to you that's not what Jude's talking about at all. Jude is talking about Zechariah chapter 3, where the angel of the Lord wrestles with Satan over the Old Testament church. The body of Moses means the Old Testament church, just like body of Christ means New Testament church. It doesn't mean Moses' corpse. And then the other one that you'll see things referred to is the last one under Apocalyptic, the Sibylline oracles. Okay? The Sibylline oracles. These are Gentile works, or they're supposed to be Gentile works. The belief was, and I'm sure there's no reason to question this, that in the Gentile world there were true prophets who were looking forward to the coming of the Jewish Messiah who would bring about world peace. And these Gentile prophets were grouped together and called Sibyls. Okay? You will see in classical Christian hymns and literature references to the Sibyls. The famous hymn, Day of Wrath, O Day of Warning, see fulfill the prophets, warning earth and heaven and ashes burning. It would be more literal to say, Day of Wrath, O Day of Mourning, prophets and the Sibyls' warning. Okay? In the Latin of the hymn, it refers to the Jewish prophets and the Gentile Sibyls. So these were supposed to be Gentile works. They're not, but that's what they were supposed to be. And actually, they can be fairly edifying, and some of them are early Christian works. They're Jewish and Christian Sibylline oracles. And the Christian ones are, of course, backdated from Christ, but they'll build on the 3 wise men and the revelations of stars that the Messiah is coming into the world and all this kind of stuff. So they can be interesting, and you'll see them referred to. I mean, you may never see any of this stuff referred to. It depends on what books you happen to read or what you might happen to hear, but you're likely at some point maybe to see a reference to Sibyls or the Sibylline oracles, and that's what they are. They're supposedly Gentile prophecies of the coming of the Golden Age and of the Messiah. Do any of you want to answer any questions about the Apocrypha or pseudepigraphical writings before we tie this off?
Yeah, would the three wise men be counted among those Gentile prophets?
The bunch of wise men who brought 3 gifts? Yes. Occasionally you'll hear it argued that since they came over from Persia, that they're actually Jewish advisors to the Persian court, left over from Nehemiah's day and Daniel's day. But their placement in the text is not such as to give us this. The wise men come because every time there's a new covenant with Israel, there's a Gentile sponsor. You always have a Gentile sponsor. Who's the Gentile sponsor of the Abrahamic covenant? Who shows up to sponsor Abraham? Melchizedek. Okay? Who's the Gentile sponsor of the Mosaic covenant? Who shows up to sponsor Moses? Jethro. Who's the Gentile sponsor of the Davidic covenant? Who sponsors the temple? Hiram of Tyre. Okay? Who's the Gentile sponsor of the Restoration covenant? Cyrus. Okay? So now we have Gentiles come and they bring gold and myrrh and incense, temple stuff. Okay? Just as these other ones gave gifts to build the temple, what they give to Jesus is temple stuff. So that's why they come, and that's who they are. So they are Gentiles. And they knew it from reading the stars. See, the Bible tells us that the stars, the constellations in the heavens, gave information. We don't know how to read that information anymore. We're not supposed to. We have these completed scriptures, which is much better. But Psalm 19 tells us that the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament shows forth day by day, pours forth speech. Their line has gone through the earth as a tent for the sun, like a bridegroom. This is reference to Samson, whose name means sun. But he runs his course. That refers to the constellations of the zodiac, which tells you a lot of information about God. But by way of contrast, the law of the Lord is perfect. If you're in Israel and you have the scriptures, the written oracles, that's much better. But the Gentiles do have this sky revelation, which we no longer know how to interpret because we've got the finished Bible. But that's what these magi could look at. They could read the sky because they still knew how to read it, as it's later, of course, been perverted into astrology. So that's who they are. And that's the kind of people that you might have supposedly writing Sibylline oracles. Gentile believers. And of course, we know from the New Testament they were God-fearing Gentiles all over the ancient world by New Testament times. So who knows? Maybe some of these Sibylline oracles were written by Gentiles. There's a whole bunch of different ones. Gentiles who had come to expect the hope of Israel. Well, let's continue on here on page 5 down to this number 5, other Jewish writings of interest. You see, we don't have any literature about the Jews until after the exile, except for the Bible. The Bible is it. We don't have any other things written by Jews. We don't have any things about the Jews written in other countries, except 1 or 2 little notices on some stele somewhere where some king says, I defeated Ahab of Israel and took his lands. Well, that's about it. That doesn't tell you much. But after the exile, down to the New Testament time, we have all this Jewish literature that's preserved for us. So that's what we're surveying. And toward the end of today and next week, we'll pull it together and discuss how that impacts how we read the New Testament. But here are the other things that are worth at least you hearing about once in your life. The first is the letter of Aristeas. The letter of Aristeas gives that mythical account of how the LXX was written. What's the LXX? Septuagint. What's the Septuagint?
Writings of the 70s.
Yeah. It's
Greek translation of the Old Testament.
it's a Greek translation of the Old Testament and of the Apocrypha. That's how the Apocrypha came into the church, because the church initially used that Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Apocrypha was in it. But the Jews always understood the Apocrypha was not inspired, and the church understood that too. But it came to be bound up inside of Bibles for that reason. And the letter of Aristeas is the one that tells us this legend about how they gave the Old Testament Hebrew text out to 6 or 7 different men, and they all worked on it for 70 days, and they got back together, and each one had produced identically the same translation. Isn't that amazing? So that's not how it really happened, but that's the myth. Then we have the works of Philo of Alexandria. Philo, he was one of these Jews living in Egypt, and he was a philosopher, a Platonist. And he's lived at the same time as Jesus and Paul. His works are looked at by historians of philosophy. Also, they give us some ideas of more philosophically oriented Judaism of the time. He tells us things that are somewhat helpful in trying to understand what on earth the Pharisees actually believed, which is very much open to question in some ways, as we'll see. But in terms of understanding the Bible, he's not of any help. What he wants to do with the book of Genesis and other places is allegorize them into ideas of Platonic philosophy. Very important are the works of Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a younger contemporary of Jesus and the disciples. He was out of a priestly family. It's usually thought that he was of the Pharisee party, although that may not be true. Who was a Pharisee and who wasn't, there's fuzzy edges on the side of that. You could be kind of like a Pharisee without actually being a card-carrying member of the secret society of Pharisees, whatever they were. So we don't know, but he was pretty conservative, and he came to see the Roman destruction of Jerusalem as a just punishment for her sins. And that's important because he wrote a long book about it called The Jewish War, which makes that point. He's not a Christian. And he does seem to be, in his writings, pulling the wool over our eyes, in that I'm not sure how trustworthy we should regard Josephus. That's always a question. You read the Gospels, and it's apparent that in the year 30 A.D., there was a series of riots in the city of Jerusalem at Passover and at Pentecost. The text tells you that. Jesus came to town after raising Lazarus, and everything had accumulated to the point the Jewish people were infuriated at their king, Herod, because he had put their prophet John the Baptist to death. So they wanted another king to replace Herod, and Jesus was the one. And the whole city was in an uproar for a week. When Jesus was crucified, the entire area was dark for 3 hours in the middle of the afternoon. That's not an eclipse. Eclipses don't last 3 hours if you've ever seen one. More like 3 minutes. All kinds of weird things happened. And then after that, on the day of Pentecost, there was all kinds of things going on. The city was in a state of uproar for months, and Josephus says nothing about it. Well, you don't write a history and leave out something that important unless you've decided to leave it out. So I'm not sure how trustworthy Josephus always is, but he's all we have for some things. He also wrote an entire history of the Old Testament and carried it through down to his own day, called the Antiquities of the Jews, which is also very useful information. It gives us a lot of information about this intertestamental period of time. It tells us how the Jews came in contact with the Romans and wrote letters to the Romans and invited the Romans to come in, and the relationship with the Roman Senate and all kinds of stuff that includes letters, which we have no reason to think these aren't real letters that he, took out of archives and copied out and put in his book. So it's quite useful information. And here Josephus, he's important. Okay. Not always hard to read either. If you like to read history, then Josephus can be fun to read. He'll tell you things about the Old Testament that you know aren't true. It's like he gets things wrong and you wonder why. Since he had the text of the Bible right there with him, why would he tell the story wrong? It's hard to know.
One reason I've heard is because he was a war captive of an earlier insurrection, and the Romans recognized his ability as a writer and hired him to do writing. Therefore, he was prone to write from a perspective that the Romans would find acceptable, and therefore continue giving him those checks to write his to do his writing.
Uh-huh.
Where there were errors, that they were things that he believed that the Romans would like.
Could well be. Thanks. All right, other things. If you ever hear references to Targums, maybe you never have, but what Targums are Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible. Remember that when we came back from exile, we couldn't read Hebrew anymore. We couldn't understand it when it was said out loud anymore. Aramaic is not Hebrew. It's similar, but it's different from Hebrew the way Spanish is different from Italian. Okay, both Romance languages, but you can't just talk Italian to a Spaniard and have them understand it. And so when we came back from exile, then Ezra would read the text, they would read the text, and then somebody else would translate it into Aramaic, and then they would preach on it. It's exactly what we do today, except we don't usually read it in Greek and Hebrew first. I mean, we could. You could, in church, read the Hebrew out loud, and then give a translation, English translation, and then preach on it. Well, they were very meticulous with the Hebrew text. You always read the Hebrew first, then you gave it in Aramaic. Well, Targums are Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible. They're not translations. They are expanded translations that give extra thoughts, implications, little like commentaries. And so they're useful to us. They help give us some understanding of what some of the Jews at that time, how they read the Bible and what they thought about it, how they tried to preach it and make applications of it. Another thing you'll hear about are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, the Dead Sea Scrolls. This information has almost no relevance to the New Testament, but because it's new and scholars are interested in it. I mean, look, if you want to get a PhD, practically everything's been written on already. So what are you going to have as your project? Well, Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a bunch of new stuff we can study and write about. So everybody writes about it, but that creates the impression that it's really important to understand the New Testament, and it's not. It's Essene literature from the Qumran community. Okay, who are the Essenes? The Essenes were the dropouts. The Essenes don't show up in the New Testament. They're not important in the New Testament. The things that they believed give us a hint as to what an extreme right wing of Judaism thought, and probably there were people in mainstream Judaism that were kind of this way, but they're not terribly important. But this Qumran community, they had their scrolls. When the Romans came in, they hid them in these caves. It's real dry. They've been preserved. We can get them out and very carefully unroll them so they don't turn to dust and read them. The Essenes rejected the temple because it was ruled by the wicked priest, and we've talked about that. It had no legitimate high priests after the days of the Maccabees. After they took it over, they were not Zadokites. They had no business being there, and because of that, the temple was defiled. The Qumran sect would have nothing to do with it. They were waiting for the true priest to come. And we read in the War Scroll, tells us about this. It's called the War Scroll for short. It's the rule for the final war. It's also called the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. And this book is apocalyptic visions about how God is going to come and set things right and put the Jews on top and settle everything. Okay? Take down the wicked priest and bring about a true priest. And there would be a Messiah priest and a Messiah king, and there are various variations on this according to who's having what fake vision. And the other important one is called the Temple Scroll, and it's a description of how the temple really ought to be. And it pretends to be laws dictated to Moses by Yahweh. It's written as if it was like the book of Leviticus, which is pretty presumptuous on the part of whoever wrote it. But there it is. The temple is defiled, but this is how the temple really ought to be. We find in the Dead Sea Scrolls many copies of various Old Testament books and other material, and so there's stuff there that's somewhat helpful in understanding the Old Testament or giving us a slightly different version, but they are a sect. The way you should think about these Essenes are like those kinds of fundamentalists who are always talking about the second coming of Jesus and who write one book after another about the tribulation. And one book says Babylon is going to be restored, and Saddam Hussein is the Antichrist. And another one says, no, Babylon is a symbol for Rome. There's going to be a new Roman Empire, and Mussolini is the Antichrist. And another one says, no, notice that in Revelation, Babylon is an economic power, and that means the Bilderberger group in the Council of Foreign Relations, and Henry Kissinger is the Antichrist. Just add up the numbers of his name and you'll see it. And so forth and so on. But that's all they talk about, you know. They don't talk about any other doctrines. All they talk about is how Jesus is coming soon. And no matter how many years go by and he doesn't come, they continue to believe this garbage. And it just goes on and on and on. You think that, you know, Hal Lindsey said it was all going to be done 40 years after 1948. Well, that's what they were all saying. It's been 40 years. It's been 50 years. It's not over yet, you know. They were all over the place how Jesus was going to come in 88. 88 reasons why Jesus is coming in 1988, because it was 40 years after 1948. Well, he didn't. Well, that guy hasn't shut up. He continues on. So this is the same kind of stuff. Now, so you've got people who are totally caught up in this, and they're like the Essenes. And then you have a whole lot of general Christian fundamentalists out there, and Baptist churches and the like, that they don't really think about this all the time. But whenever the pastor preaches on it, he does preach this kind of thing. Okay, so I think the Essenes show us an extreme form of apocalyptic expectation of a fantasy end of the world, but a more moderate form of that was probably circulating around in Israel more generally, among people who didn't just eat, sleep, and breathe that stuff all the time. But when they did think about the future, it tended to be kind of like that. So the Essene stuff can help us a little bit that way.
What do you make of the limited dissemination that this is for? You think that's just politics among a few scholars?
Yeah, it is. Some of them have caught out, but they were divided up among scholars and among scholars in different nations, and they were all very jealous about them. And there's some, the guy's been working on it for 40 years to translate it, and it still isn't translated, and he's not letting it out. If you read Biblical Archaeology Review, you just see the continuing wars and grievances about this stuff not being published and translated. So there's nothing as petty as a university community. My father was the head of the Modern Foreign Languages Department, and I grew up in a university community, and you haven't seen petty until you've seen, people who don't have any real power love to exercise it. So churches can be that way too. You know, the guy whose wife beats him up at home and whose boss beats him up on the job would love to be an elder in the church and boss people around there, since he can't boss people anywhere else. I'm not speaking of our situation. I have seen this. This is a common problem, okay? And it is,
You mentioned the writings of the Essenes are not so beneficial in understanding the New Testament, but haven't they been determined to be relatively significant and basically just given validity to the Old Testament text that we do have?
Yes, that's a good point. People who would question just how good our Old Testament Hebrew texts are, we dig up these things from the Dead Sea and we carbon date them for 200, 300 BC, and they're pretty much the same as our Hebrew text. That has been of great help in substantiating.
Yeah, I was in California, and they had the Dead Sea Scrolls on exhibit, and I took my Bible, and they had a scripture out of Leviticus that was identical to what was in my Bible.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you get this idea that how do you know that the translation of the Bible hasn't lost its...
Yeah, because our Masoretic text, which we take to be what God preserved for us and from which our translation is made, what we have of that is about 800 or 900 A.D. So this gives us texts about 1,000 years earlier or more, which are identical to what we have from 800 A.D. It's very nice to have that. Okay, I want to finish this up and tell you about a couple of other things. So we've got sort of the eschatological fringe out here, and that's the Essenes. I think it's important to understand that God does not want people dropping out. And there have been dropout sects throughout the history of the church, and we can all kind of have a tendency to sect off and separate ourselves from our society and not stay in it. Jesus is not like that. There are two groups of people in the New Testament times who just separated themselves from society. Essenes are one of them, and Jesus just doesn't have anything to do with them at all. They've dropped out of history. They're not part of God's plan. The other group are the Sadducees, who are aristocrats and stay in the city of Jerusalem, basically. The good people are the Pharisees. The Pharisees are out among the people trying to disciple them in terms of the Scriptures. And that's the people that Jesus respects. That's the people who should have heard what Jesus had to say. Many of them did. And that's the people Jesus hangs with. When he goes out to dinner, it's at the home of a Pharisee, because they're the people who are out in the world, wrestling with the hard problems, dealing with the sinners, trying to disciple the people. And the fact that there's nothing about Essenes in the New Testament, I think, is in itself a pregnant condemnation of dropout mentality. Anabaptists and Amish and all those kinds of people. Now, the last two things we have down here are the Mishnah and the Talmuds. What was beginning to happen in Jesus' day and had been going on for some time, although we don't know how long and how far it had developed in Jesus' day, was the belief that the scriptures that God gave to Moses, the 5 books of Moses that we have here, the laws that God gave in Leviticus and Exodus and the second half of Exodus, are incomplete. And that God had also given oral commands to Moses, which we call the oral law. Now, this is obviously true in a sense. If you look at the book of Exodus and you try to build the tabernacle, and you try to build all the pieces of furniture, it tells you how big the ark was, and it tells you how big the table of face bread was, it tells you how to make the altar, and it tells you to make a laver of cleansing, and it doesn't tell you anything about what it looked like, how big it was, or anything else. All we know about the laver of cleansing is that there was a pedestal, and then there was a freestanding dish on top of it. Whether it was 8-sided or round, or whether it was this big or this big, how high off the ground it was, we don't know any of that. All we know is that the water inside that represented the waters above the firmament, because it's up off the ground, and that dish represents the firmament, okay? So that when you're washing things, you're washing it with water from above, heavenly water. Now, that's all we know. So, obviously, God must have told Moses the right size and shape of it. But it wasn't written down because we're not supposed to know it. And there are other things. What does it say in Leviticus chapter 2? Maybe you remember this. If you're going to have a grain offering, or more literally a tribute offering, what kind of flour are you required to use? Can you use barley? No, it has to be semolina of wheat. Now, for 40 years we're in the wilderness and there ain't no wheat. All there is manna. So did they just not do grain offerings for 40 years? Or did God say, you can use manna for grain offerings until you get into the promised land? We don't know. But I'm sure God told Moses what to do. Okay. Did they continue having Passovers every year? We know they didn't circumcise, which means that year after year there were fewer and fewer men coming to Passover because all the younger men weren't circumcised and they couldn't come. Did they have Passovers, or did they just not have Passovers for 38 years because they didn't circumcise? Well, we don't know. But God probably told Moses what to do. We're just not told it. It'd be nice to know some of these things, but we don't know them. All right? So there must have been oral commands. Well, the Jews believed they had figured out what they were. They were beginning to figure them out. Okay, we can look at the text, we can deduce, we can figure out what God must have said about whether to use manna or not, and then that becomes a sure thing. Now, that's not the important thing. The important thing was extra rules and regulations for the Sabbath day, how far you can travel on the Sabbath, how you're supposed to wash your hands with your fist, all these different things, and you see them referred to in the Gospels. These things were becoming, in the minds of people, this second group of laws that God gave to Moses, but they weren't supposed to be written down because they were secret information. The written stuff you could share with the Gentiles. They could read it. They could hear it. The oral stuff was supposed to be kept only for Israel. Now, after the destruction of the temple, these oral laws were written down. And the book that has them in it is called the Mishnah. If you ever see references to the Mishnah is not a commentary on the Old Testament. It really doesn't have anything to do with the Old Testament. It is a collection of all the oral laws. Now, this is actually written down after AD 70 by a group of people who are really into this, but it must have been developing earlier. And Jesus refers to the traditions of the fathers, and you set aside the law by your traditions. This is what he's referring to. This is the stuff that's coming up. I've given you some really weird examples of it, but there are more moderate things in it too. But they're still off, and there's still a wrong belief that God had given this secret, arcane knowledge in the oral law. That's what the Mishnah is. And then there are the Talmuds. There are two Talmuds. There's a Jerusalem Talmud, which is this fat. And then there's the Babylonian Talmud, which is this fat. That's a huge, long thing. What these are is they're collections of conversations between rabbis about the meaning of the Mishnah, not about the meaning of the Old Testament. Okay? The Talmuds are not commentaries on the Old Testament. They don't tell you what the Jews thought about the Old Testament. They tell you what the Jews, how they debated the oral law. Okay? And the oral law is the Mishnah. So, when you hear about the Talmud, don't think of it as having much of anything to do with the Bible. It doesn't. And Jews know that. If I had a rabbi in here, he would say, oh yes, that's exactly right. We have the written law, the scripture, we have the oral law. The Mishnah is the oral law, the Talmuds are discussions about the oral law. Both are equally important to us as Jews. Now there was one group of Jews after AD 70 who said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with the oral law. They said, no, there is no oral law, there's only the Bible. These people were called the Karaites. Apparently, they came from the Sadducees, who were in the temple, and the Sadducees did not have any use for the oral law. Oral law was a Pharisee thing. As they tried to make applications out among the common people, they came up with this stuff. The Sadducees didn't care about the common people, and so they were not interested in it. The Karaites existed for several centuries, and a small group within them are the Masoretes. And the Masoretes are the people who preserved the Hebrew Bible absolutely strictly for us. Our Hebrew Bible is the Masoretic text, preserved by the Sadducees, who had no interest in the oral law. All the rest of the Jews said, we're not really all that interested in this anymore. We're interested in this oral law. That's what they talked about. Karaites and the Masoretes continued to preserve the text, and in the providence of God, that's where we get our Hebrew text. I'm sorry we went over today. Next week, we will do this handout that I gave you today, okay? And we will get the sects and beliefs of the Jews at that time, so stick that in your Bible and save it.